Everything you ever wanted to know about startup compensation, but were afraid to ask. Today, we are going to do a tear down of startup compensation, this mysterious thing that nobody quite well understands. And in order to do that, I'm joined today by Peter Walker, who is the head of insights at Carta. Before we get started, I think it's great for the audience to get to know more about Peter, your journey, and how you got to where you are today.
So, as you said, I'm the head of insights at Carta. And all that means is that I exist and my team exists to make Carta data more useful. So Carta sits on about 38,000 startup cap tables at this point. So we have access to probably the biggest private market database anywhere in the world. And my background into this job is I've worked at startups my whole career, from a Series A startup back in DC to I kind of did some moonlighting work as the head of data visualization for the COVID tracking project as well. So all of that combined sort of leads me to this position of making Carta data more useful to founders, investors, and employees.
If you're considering joining a startup, the number one question I bet on your mind is, how does my compensation look? Your compensation at FAANG companies is very different from the compensation that you receive at a startup. Let's say you're making $2 million a year at a typical FAANG company, and you are a director or a senior director at Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, name your favorite FAANG company. Typically, your compensation will break down as follows. You will have a base salary, you'll have a bonus, and then you will have equity. The higher up you go in your corporate ladder, the more your compensation tilts towards equity. Now let's take a hypothetical example, and let's break down this $2 million into its subsequent components. Let's say as a director, senior director at a FAANG company, your base is $400K, you make a bonus of about $150K, and your equity, which vests every year, is roughly around $1.45 million. That totals a compensation of $2 million for you every year. Now, mind you, this compensation is liquid. What do I mean by that? I mean that at the end of the year, this is the compensation you receive in your bank account, per se, from these FAANG companies. Now, let's say you join a startup. At a startup, your base salary is typically less than your FAANG base salary. Some startups are able to match it, but most startups will not. But let's assume the startup that you're joining is able to match your base salary, and your base salary is roughly around $300 to $400K. Bonus? Well, I'm here to tell you, most startups do not offer bonuses at an early stage. Only when they become much more mature, they start to offer bonuses. And equity, this is where a large part of your startup compensation will be at. You will be offered an amazing amount of equity that is not liquid and has a strike price associated with it. If you do the math here, you imagine that you're going from $2 million in compensation, liquid compensation, down to just $300 to $400K per year in liquid compensation, and the rest is tied to the startup equity, which will only vest and which will only be of value if the startup strikes good. Strike price is the value of the equity that you have to pay to buy that equity from the company. Even though your equity is vesting based on a year worth of performance at that company, you still have a strike price that you pay to acquire that equity. 2, this equity becomes valuable when there is a liquidity event for a startup. A liquidity event is typically defined as an IPO or a sale of a company to another company. The average time to get to IPO is roughly 8 years from start to IPO. So you will have to wait multiple years before you can cash out on this equity. And last but not the least, if you leave the company before the liquidity event, you get a typical window of 90 days to buy the vested equity from this startup. Otherwise, that equity also vanishes and expires, and you're left with nothing. By now, you might be wondering, why the heck would I even join a startup if this is what's going on? But I'm here to tell you, it's a very rewarding journey if you understand how these things work, and you can plan around it to find the right startup which has the right plan and the right liquidity event to make sure that your compensation is worth it. Peter, most startups do not see the light at the end of the tunnel and die out. In fact, from your own research, about 45% of the seed startups never went on to raise another round. I would love for you to tell our audience, how does this landscape look like?
Yeah, so it's important to understand that when you're joining a startup, you're taking on a much heavier risk than if you're joining your standard FAANG company. So we did an analysis of all of the seed stage startups that were started on Carta in 2017, just as an example. And that was over 1,000 individual companies. About 45% of those companies never got beyond the seed stage. They never did another fundraising. So it is a much bigger risk to start at a startup than to go to a Google or a Facebook.
Most startup founders will eventually add early employees who tend to get significant part of the company's equity as they're taking a significant amount of risk in joining a startup at that early of a stage. These early employees tend to have a founder's mindset, and they're willing to join an early stage startup because they believe in the mission and they believe that they can take the startup to the next level. For the audience that is looking to join as an early employee of an early stage startup, can you share what type of equity they should expect?
Sure. So if we're talking about the very earliest employees, you've got the founder team on one side, and that's about 1 to 3 people typically. And when we talk about the first 5 employees that join after the founders, that's hires number 1 through hire number 5. The typical ranges that you see for equity packages in this case are around 1% for that first hire. For the second employee, it goes down to about 0.5%, maybe a little bit of range there. And then again, lower for hires number 3, 4, and 5. So you can see that while you do receive a decent portion of the company, 2% of a given company is quite a lot of equity. If that company turns out to be Facebook, there is still a significant risk that you're joining after the founding team. So the first 5 hires, as you mentioned, it should be someone who's deeply involved in the mission, believes strongly that this is not only the company that they're going to make riches out of or get wealthy off of, but this is the company that they want to help grow in the world, that they want to see exist.
When you join an earlier stage company, and let's say you're an early employee and you get 1% of the equity, you got to remember that as the startup raises further rounds, your employee equity would start to get diluted. The 1% at the start will not be 1% by the time the company has raised multiple rounds at, say, Series B, C, and D. And this is an important concept that all of us must understand. Can you tell us what dilution is and how should I benchmark against the future risk of dilution of my equity?
And essentially all that means is that a portion of your ownership gets reduced over time as new people join the cap table. And a lot of startup employees have this incorrect assumption about what happens when an investor or someone comes onto the company, makes an investment, and then gets a portion of those shares. Most people think that somehow the shares that already exist are sort of taken away from people and given to those investors. That's not what happens. The company just actually issues a lot more shares. So it's a bigger pie overall. And each corresponding slice of that pie gets a little smaller. So if you're given, say, that 1% of the company up front as a first employee, when your company goes on to raise from Series A investors and puts a couple $1 million into the company is going to issue a lot more shares to those investors. So your 1% probably becomes something like 0.8%. And then again, that same process happens when you raise a Series B. Maybe it goes down to 0.6% at that point. So you can see that your ownership over time in the company is decreasing, but you hold the same number of shares that you always held.
The other thing to recognize is that the company goes from being a seed stage company to a Series A, Series B, and Series D company. The risk factors for that company tend to decrease over time. As you go from one round to the other, you start to prove different hypotheses and you start to gain confidence that the vision that you have can actually come to fruition. So if you join a later stage company as an employee, you're taking much less risk if you were to join the same company but at a seed or a Series A stage. This is important to understand because your compensation is a direct reflection of the risk you are taking. If you join the earlier stage company, in order to compensate for the risk that you're taking, you get a higher equity in that company. However, if you join a later stage company, let's say Series C or D, you get less equity in that company because the startup has already proven to be a viable option in this market. Now, the big question is, what is strike price? Many of you might have heard this term called strike price. Now, this is an important concept to understand when you're joining a startup. This is defined as the amount of money that an employee has to pay to acquire or buy the equity that they earned at the company. Peter, why does a strike price even exist? And what should I think about in terms of benchmarking the strike price of the company that I'm joining at?
So a strike price, also known as an exercise price, as you mentioned, is the amount of money per share you'll need to pay to exercise your right to own those shares. So typically when you're granted stock options, they come along with 2 criteria. One is a vesting schedule. So you're not going to get all those stock options up front. You're going to need to work for the company for a period of time, and then those stock options will appear in your account. And then the second criteria is you'll need to exercise the right to those options. And that's where the strike price comes in. So again, when you're considering a strike price, just know that this strike price is driven by an entirely separate valuation called 409A from whatever the VCs think your company is worth. So those are two very separate valuation structures. And the preferred post-money valuation, that's the standard name for the VC valuation. That's what you and the investors have agreed on. That's what your startup's worth right now.
One of the most controversial topics to talk about in startup compensation is the exercise period when you decide to quit a company. When you join a startup, you are excited, you're passionate, you want to spend the rest of your life building this startup, and in the process, you have the compensation to be worthwhile your effort. However, over a year, 2 or 3, things may or may not work out, and you might decide to leave that startup at the end of the 2nd or the 3rd year or whatever is the preferred time for you. When you do leave that company, I want you to know that you have an exercise period before which you must acquire these stock options that were vested for you. Otherwise, you have nothing left for you.
It's true. There is typically what's called an exercise period after you leave a company, after which your stock options just return to the company and you get no value out of them. So that exercise window is typically only 90 days, which seems like a very short amount of time to make such an important financial decision. To be honest, it is a short amount of time. Most of that 90-day period is the way it is because it's driven off of the taxation requirements for different options. So 90 days is about as long as many companies want to offer you. But to be clear, it's not set in stone. Some companies like Amplitude and others, they actually offer 10-year exercise windows. So when you quit the company, you'd have 10 years in that example to exercise your stock options, which is amazing. That's very employee friendly, but it is not common at all.
You must interrogate the founder and the leadership of a company to get all the answers you need to make an informed decision about the compensation offer you're receiving from a startup. If your startup gets sold for $1 billion, that doesn't necessarily mean that any money will hit your bank account. And the dirty little secret behind that is called liquidity preferences. This is the term that every company has when they're raising funds from venture capitalists, and it varies from venture capitalist to venture capitalist, but the liquidity preferences state how much money will be paid out to the investors at the time of a liquidity event before any of that money hits the employees. The other dirty secret of Silicon Valley compensation and valuation of startups is liquidation preferences created by venture capitalists who invest in those startups. A typical liquidation preference is such that the money at the time of a liquidity event will first go to the person who invested into that company due to the liquidity preferences that they stated in the VC funding round.
The easiest way to think about a liquidation preference is in a waterfall model. So imagine in your head that there's a waterfall coming down, and that waterfall is all the money that your startup was sold for. Let's say you sold your startup for $100 million. That's a wonderful exit. So there's $100 million coming down that waterfall. And what happens is it hits the first ledge, and that first ledge in the waterfall is money to investors. So they get paid back first, and then it goes to people like advisors, and then it goes down to people like founders and employees. Generally speaking, the employee will only own common stock in a startup, and that common stock is at the bottom of that waterfall. And it's pretty common across a lot of rounds to have some sort of liquidation preference for the investors. And liquidation preference just means that the investor will be paid out before the employee. So again, you are very likely as an employee going to be at the bottom of that waterfall. Hopefully, there's still a lot of cash to pay you out when that happens. But in some cases, that 100 million will dry up before it hits employees, and they actually won't see any value out of this waterfall.
The last year has been incredibly tough on many employees. There have been layoffs, news after layoff news from almost all top tech companies in Silicon Valley and even around the world. The layoff news deeply affects employees' morale as well as the compensation that they receive when they leave those companies. Let's take a look at how the layoff trends are tapering off or increasing over time.
So across the 38,000 startups that use Carta for their cap table, we can track when an employee leaves or joins the company based on when they get a stock option grant. So in the chart you're looking at now, the white line is employees that leave the company by choice, whether for another job or just to try something else. And the orange line is employees who are unfortunately laid off. And you can see there was a rapid increase in the number of employees who were laid off all throughout 2022, peaking in the beginning of this year. Thankfully, that line has come back down in February and March and then into Q2 of this year. But The other side of that is that the number of people who are leaving by choice is also going down. To put it bluntly, like people are staying in place at their current place of work a lot longer than they did in the Great Resignation period of 2022. And that has significant impacts on compensation for startups, because if fewer people are leaving, that means that companies typically have fewer back hires to make. They don't have to hire as many people as they expected. And the people that are joining on average just have less leverage in negotiations when it comes to their compensation overall.